This morning we'll have a panel of 3 speakers that will be talking about achieving clean water through relationship building, which is a topic that's relevant, I'm sure, to all of our jobs and all of the work that we do. So first of all, our first speaker will be Amit Pradhananga. Amit is a research associate in the Department of Forest Resources and the Center for Changing Landscapes at the University of Minnesota. His research centers on investigating the human, social, and policy dimensions of natural resources in the context of water resource, invasive species, and recreation resource management, as well as climate change adaptation. He has led multiple projects using quantitative and qualitative social science research methodologies on a range of topics, including conservation practice adoption, community engagement, groundwater protection, and park and trail visitor experiences. In addition, he provides training in social science assessment methods to natural resource professionals from state and local agencies and organizations. Secondly, you'll hear from Kimberly Musser, and as Associate Director of the Water Resources Center at the Minnesota State University Mankato, Kimberly feels fortunate to work on educational and planning projects that promote cleaner water and improved watershed health. She focuses on outreach projects to distill and disseminate watershed information. She collaborates with citizens and local conservation partners on watershed planning projects. Kimberly is increasingly driven to better understand the human and social dimension of watershed work, supporting partnerships that promote local decision-making and action. She holds a BA in Geography from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MA in Community and Regional Planning from the University of Oregon. And finally, our third panelist today is Paul Nelson. Paul currently serves as the Environmental Service Program Manager for Scott County. He has a BS in Biology from Central Michigan and an MS in Forestry from North Carolina State University. At North Carolina, he focused on soil physics and agricultural engineering, and upon graduating could solve differential equations and run drain mod. In other words, he was technically oriented. However, in the late 90s, he became convinced that technical information does not motivate people to behave sustainably and became interested in how individuals, communities, and organizations make decisions. His interest changed again in the mid-2000s when he realized that changing behaviors was largely relationship and trust-based. This is about the time he became the Natural Resources Manager for Scott County. In the late 2000s, he started working with Dr. May Davenport and Dr. Amit Pradhananga. Since then, he has tried to put into applications findings from those doctors, and just 2 weeks ago learned that dopamine can be slightly addicting. You'll need to pay attention during the talk to figure out how that is relevant. Please help me in welcoming our panelists today.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here today. I want to thank Tina for that wonderful introduction. I cannot wait to hear about dopamine. And I'd also like to thank the Water Resources Conference Planning Committee for inviting us to speak here today. And before I start, I also want to thank my research supervisor, colleague, and mentor, Dr. May Davenport, who unfortunately could not be here today to present. So resource managers have traditionally asked themselves, as it relates to water resource protection, have traditionally asked themselves, what do communities, what do people need to know about water resource protection? Or what do people need to have to protect water resources? Do they need money? Do they need technical expertise and technical assistance? These have been kind of the traditional questions asked around water resource management. What we're going to argue today is that the more important question to ask is, what do people need to feel to become engaged in water resource protection? Do they need to feel empowered? Do they need to feel concerned, responsible? Do they need to feel that there is community leadership? And do they need to feel supported in order to be able to be more engaged in water conservation? I wanted to start out by asking this question. Did anyone see this piece of news yesterday about how USDA funded a program called Wonder, kind of a voluntary-based program? Yes, no? Feel free to shout out. No, obviously you didn't. This is very obvious that you didn't because this is not real. This does not exist. This program doesn't exist. If you said you did, then I would really doubt what you're talking about. All right. This is not real. This is a social scientist dream. Specifically, this is May's dream that really focuses on rethinking our approach to water resource problems, rethinking how we even define water resource problem, and redefining it more as a social problem, rethinking what are solutions to water resource problems. And so this approach would focus on developing those individual level as well as societal norms for water protection. It would focus on empowering communities and particularly on building relationships. And so what we like to say is that think of this as a program where the primary BMP, or best management practice, is relationship building. And this type of program would focus on some key aspects that are not very typical of traditional management regimes, where we'd focus on developing leadership at the local level around conservation, where we'd focus on developing those social networks where people connect with each other, share information with one another through these relations that would be built through a program like this. And then there would be a lot of social feedback, so people would get feedback about how they're doing in terms of conservation. We'd have a lot of information flow happening both ways with the public. And another long-term goal of a program like this would be social monitoring. So just like we do ecological monitoring, a program like this would focus on collecting social data over the long term and really focus on communities and community building. So this idea for this program in a lot of ways is based on social science research, a lot of which we've also done at the Center for Changing Landscapes. Over the years, we've conducted multiple studies in over 20 watersheds in Minnesota. We've used different types of methodology, social science research methods, a lot of quantitative surveys. We've also done qualitative interviews and focus groups. We've conducted hundreds of interviews and thousands of surveys to try to really get at questions of what do communities feel? How ready are communities to address water resource problems? What are individual values and beliefs, and how might they guide behavior? What really drives actions? What are constraints to actions? And how can we get people more engaged, more involved in conservation? And this idea of what drives action is a key impetus for a lot of our research. And so here's some findings and some key lessons that we've learned about what drives action. This also relates to what we really know from social science about what really drives behavior change, what drives action. So there's a lot of assumption about if we provide people with the right information, if we provide people with technical information and the facts and figures, that they will eventually do the right thing, they'll change behavior. Well, from years and in fact decades of research in social psychology and environmental psychology, we know that this doesn't necessarily always happen. Just providing people with information and education and hoping that that would end in change in behavior doesn't necessarily work out. The next question we ask is, well, is it then about money? What if we just keep paying people to do this? To a certain extent, that has worked to push people who may be on the edge thinking about whether or not I can actually adopt different types of conservation practice, become more involved. But then the key question to ask is, how long can we really afford to pay people to be engaged in conservation, adopt those best management practices? So again, money for conservation doesn't necessarily lead to sustained action. I think it's a good approach maybe towards one-shot, one-time action, but how can we really sustain that model over the long term? What we're arguing here is that what we really need to do is motivate people to become involved. We need to inspire people to take on roles in communities and become more involved, more engaged in water resource protection. So I wanted to throw this question out to the audience. Again, feel free to scream out. What really motivates you? What motivates you about water resource protection? What motivates you to do the work that you do? Quality of life. Anything else? Better future. Better future for everyone. Anything else that motivates you? I'm sorry, I didn't hear something about water. Clear lake water, so just the desire to have clear lake water. I think there was something else around here. To make a difference, all right. So we're really motivated by our values, our passions, our ethic. You know, we want to make a difference. We want to see clean water. We want to have a better future. We're concerned about not just ourselves, but about our future generations. So there's a lot of, you know, I could just kind of end there. I should just walk off. No. There's a lot we know about motivation, right? Just by asking each other in this room. So how do we motivate Minnesotans to become involved in water resource protection, and what do we know from social science? What does social science tell us about this? One is that from social science in general, but also drawing on our research, we know that money and cost share and payments are not the only driver of conservation behavior. As I already spoke about, this idea that money doesn't necessarily lead to sustained action, it's not a really good long-term sustainable plan. There are other factors that do drive behavior. In our research, we found that while financial resources could be a constraint for a lot of communities, it is not necessarily the only or the primary driver of behavior. There are a lot of other factors, social psychological factors, that drive behavior. So there's factors such as values and norms that also drive behavior. One of the things that we know from environmental psychology is that our actions, everything we do is only a reflection of our deeply held values. There are values that we individually hold. There are societal norms about what's a good thing to do, what's not a good thing to do, and all of these things drive our action. And so in order to motivate and inspire people, we really need to appeal to those values and norms. So this study we've been working on this year, it's a statewide survey of residents asking them about the value of water. And so here I have a set of slides that are very encouraging findings, right? So Minnesotans do value water. That shouldn't be really surprising. And Minnesotans value water for different reasons. So you can see up on the chart here, 99% of residents we surveyed reported that clean drinking water is important to them. And so there's a range of different types of values that people hold around water. So they're also concerned about future generations. In fact, the least kind of valuable aspect of water they see is using it for lawns and landscaping. We also ask in the survey if and how people value clean streams, rivers, and lakes, and if they see that as part of their community, and how important of a part of their community is it. And we found that 75% of our respondents reported that clean water is an extremely important part of their community. We've also seen that now we're getting towards what do people feel, right? So people do feel concerned about water pollution. People feel concerned about water pollution and its effects on future generations. And so this is another kind of way to look at how do people value water. What we did with this work was we have all this social data, survey data that we collected, and we then took that and mapped it out on a landscape. So this is a study in Nicollet County, where we're, again, addressing the question of what drives action. And we asked the question about how important are clean water, clean rivers, lakes to residents and landowners in the area. And so the more green you see on the screen means that there's more of a value, more of an importance placed on water resources. And so you can see a lot of green on that screen, right? So there's, again, encouraging finding that people clearly value water. People also feel a strong sense of personal obligation, this moral norms that they have within them that I need to do something about conservation. So this is based on 2 studies in lower Minnesota and middle Minnesota watershed. A majority of our respondents feel that sense of personal obligation. They feel personally responsible to do something about water pollution, and they're also very concerned about the consequence of water pollution for future generations. Another key finding here, where we're now getting at these ideas of, there are certain gaps, right? There are certain strengths and encouraging findings that we find. But here we start seeing some gaps in terms of how people are more likely more intend more to engage in individual level actions. So people are more likely to say that they will adopt conservation practices such as cover crops and conservation tillage than to talk to others and work with others, attend those meetings, become civically engaged, and take those civic actions. So with these two studies in lower Minnesota and middle Minnesota, we see that gap between individual and collective level action. And for me, that really points to, we have a relationship issue. We are very fine in terms of dealing with our own private lives and adopting those practices, but we don't feel that we have those relationships to build on, and we don't have that connection with others, and we're not willing to talk to others about conservation. Which leads me to this idea of why do relationships even matter when it comes to water resource protection? And my simple answer to that is, particularly in this voluntary management kind of regime, non-point source pollution and addressing issues of non-point source pollution really depends on how much do landowners and farmers and residents and businesses participate in our programs, how involved and how engaged they are in conservation across the state. So in order to get people more engaged, more involved, it is critical that we start building those relationships, start getting to know people. So a little bit here about relationship building, and Kim and Paul will provide a lot more of those practical ideas and lessons learned from local clean water projects. Here I want to talk a little bit about some general principles. So firstly, get to know people. So anyone who's ever had any sort of relationship knows that it really just starts out by getting to know people, right? You don't ask people to sign contracts. You don't propose anyone to get married before you get to know them. So get to know people. It's very critical that we first conduct that assessment and we figure out how do people relate to water resources, how important or unimportant are water resources in everything else that's going on in their life. So these are some findings that are based out of a study we conducted in Scott County in 2011, where we found that a vast majority of people are concerned about the consequences of water pollution. They are also have this sense of responsibility to protect water resources, but a small proportion, only 22%, believe that their community has the leadership it takes to protect water resources. And so I wanted to kind of illustrate how social science findings could be used in terms of designing and refining programs. There's a direct link between understanding communities and then going back and saying, okay, we have to either change or keep doing what we're doing in terms of our communication campaigns, in terms of our conservation programs that we offer to communities. So one of the key changes, and Paul will perhaps be able to speak to this in a lot more detail, is in communication campaigns, Scott County had, after some of this work, focused a lot more on communicating those ecological and social community level benefits of water resources. In order to show appreciation, they started hosting events that then allow people to connect with one another and build those relationships. And then this idea of promoting success stories. So if anytime there's any successes in terms of water quality outcomes and in terms of participation of landowners and farmers, promoting those as successes, that's an idea that really starts to build more momentum towards conservation. Second, again, just like any other relationship, a key to any relationship is communication. So we want to provide regular feedback. Feedback, this is an idea that's very similar to providing information, except that it's a lot more tailored, very targeted type of information. One of the things that we found in our studies, both looking at urban watersheds, so urban watersheds in the metro area, and a rural watershed, in this case I have the example of Nicollet County, is that while people believe that Minnesota needs better water protection, they're very supportive of water protection, a much smaller proportion of people believe that their community or their neighborhood has the local leadership that's needed to protect water resources. And the other key finding is that people are also less familiar with water resources in their communities and in their neighborhoods. The other thing we found, particularly with farmers, is that anywhere between 45 to 55%, depending on which watershed we're looking at, are also more likely to adopt conservation practices if they see that link between their actions of using practices versus water quality outcomes, that they need to see that if I adopt a conservation practice, it ends up in better water quality results. So what's really needed is that we need to make issues about water resources, water pollution local, and we need to provide this very specific, tailored information about water resource conditions and the actions that people could take. A particular kind of strategy that could be used, and it's been used quite a bit in household conservation, it's been used a little bit more now in this whole arena of water resource management as well, is called benchmarking. And the idea there really is that we're providing this very tailored, very specific level feedback to residents, landowners, and farmers. And along with this information, what we're also providing is some way of comparing what they're doing, what actions they're taking, to what others around them are doing. So that's more of a social feedback, relating it to everybody else around them. And from a social perspective, what it does is it reinforces that engaging in conservation in this community is normal. It reinforces those social norms. It also encourages people to exchange information. A latest example of this that I've seen is this traffic signs, these signs on traffic lights that compare, that give you information about how often people stop for pedestrians. So I really like this as an idea of benchmarking because it's providing very specific information, and it's also providing it at a time when it's most salient, when you're driving, right? This is coming straight out of my energy bill, where I'm able to look at my daily energy use and compare it to my neighborhood averages. In fact, I can look at every hour, every 15 minutes, and break it down that way. So I know when I did laundry, that's when I use a lot of energy, and how that compares to the neighborhood average. A third key idea in terms of building relationship is building trust. I hear the word trust almost everywhere I go. You know, it's all these birds chirping, trust, 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 everywhere. So build trust. Build trust. Trust is the foundation of any strong relationship. Trust is something that's very difficult to build, but easy to break. And the way we build trust is by having positive interactions, repeated positive interactions. So first, one of the things we need to find out is, what are these social influencers? Who are these social influencers? Who influences people in their conservation decision-making around water? One of the things we've found, this is out of a study in partnership with the Water Resource Center and the Board of Water and Soil Resources around perennial and cover crops. What we found is that outside of family, these are the top 5 social influencers for farmers. In particular, we also ask what source is most highly trusted, and across this survey, but also across a lot of other studies, we found that soil and water conservation districts are consistently rated as one of the most trusted sources of information about conservation and one of the most influential when it comes to farmers making their decisions. Fourth key point is cultivate local leadership. Again, as I kind of briefly mentioned, there's some of these studies we've looked at, we've found that both in urban and rural areas that people feel that they do have the ability to change their behavior, to change their practices. They feel like they can make an impact in their communities, but a much smaller proportion feel that their community has that leadership to protect water resources. So what is really lacking here is that Minnesotans really lack that confidence in local leadership. So we're really used to this idea of managing water resources, particularly managing the biophysical aspects of managing water resources, but not so much with this idea of leadership. Leadership is really about, it's about enhancing people's ability to become more involved. It's about motivating, and it's about inspiring people. That's very different from the idea of management. And what I'm arguing here is that we need more leadership in water resource management. So I want to end with kind of taking you back to this idea of wonder before I hand it over to Kim and Paul. this wonderful program, this dream idea that may kind of dreamed up. There are already some existing programs that have key elements of this wonder idea of building relationships, of developing these norms. And Kim and Paul will talk here a little bit about some local clean water projects and what are some lessons learned there. There's also the example of the Master Stewards program that's from the Freshwater Society. We Are Water from the Minnesota Humanities Center. The key focus on a lot of these programs is, again, on building relationships, connecting people to one another around water resources. And just out of state, Wisconsin's Lake Leaders Institute, again, the focus there is also on looking at communities and community building. There are some resources available. So May developed this idea of social measures monitoring system in coordination with multiple agencies. And this is really a framework that helps us collect social data and keep track of and monitor social data over long term, where then we can try to assess and track how our community is changing. Is there capacity to protect water resources? Are there ability to become more involved in water resources changing over time? And then finally, I want to end with just pointing out this one resource where if you are interested in getting more information about specific case studies around relationship building and how research might inform this idea of relationship building, this book called Inspiring Action is a great resource as well. And with that, I want to thank you all again and want to pass it over to Kim.
Good morning. So I have to confess, when they approached me about sharing this case study, I kind of chuckled to myself and I thought about this graph. And this was a grand experiment and a great learning experience. And I'm here representing a whole group of conservation partners and landowners and citizens across the Watonwan River watershed that were part of a Watershed and Restoration Protection Strategy Civic Engagement Project. So where is the Watonwan anyway? So we are in the Minnesota River Basin. We are part of the Greater Blue Earth River Basin system. So the Watonwan flows into the Blue Earth, which flows into the Minnesota, which flows into the Mississippi. So to give you kind of orientation where we are in Minnesota, it contains all of Watonwan County and parts of Blue Earth, Brown, Cottonwood, Jackson, and Martin County. So this watershed is about 560,000 square acres, give you an idea of the size. And it's a high loader of pollutants, and there are lots of water quality impairments. So this project was framed up by two Minnesota Pollution Control Agency civic engagement specialists. And they did a lot of research on what is not working with the previous civic engagement efforts. And so we inherited this huge binder full of their collected wisdom. So this is Lynn Colsey and Cindy Hilmo. And they said what we really need is a much more nimble approach to try to solve these very complex problems and a more iterative approach that uses more system thinking. So we had all this great research at the onset of this project that we're trying to make sense of. And then our MPCA project manager, Paul Nelson, he said, we want to work with people differently, and we want to find out what they want to do. So those are our marching orders. And then we heard this social scientist, Ryan Atwell, talk, who had a lot of successes working in rural landscapes. And one of the things that he said was, if you really get to know what's happening in the physical system, so really study the physical landscape, and then start meeting people and talking to people and start understanding the social landscape, that there might be some opportunities, what he called these leverage points for change. So these are some, like, if you really start looking for particular barriers or places that are stuck in a system or some opportunities that you can throw energy at, you can start to maybe make some changes in a system. So that idea really kind of captured our imagination at the onset of this project. And then we had the great opportunity to learn from May and Amit and all their interesting research and their community capacity model. And they trained us how to conduct interviews and how to hold focus groups. So we set out on this project inspired by the work and said, let's just go out and listen and learn and try to learn about the community side of the equation. And we talked to people all over the watershed. We talked to farmers, we talked to recreationalists, we talked to entrepreneurs, we talked in big groups, we talked in small groups with city folks. But the real heart of the project was this 27 one-on-one interviews that my colleague Dusty Anderson did with farmers across the watershed. So these were very in-depth one-on-one interviews, and we used a template that we developed with May and Amit, and really tried to understand how they connect with water, what are they thinking about. And Dusty grew up on a farm and is really grounded in these issues to start with, and he works in a soil and water conservation district office. But he really grew this much deeper empathy for how much farmers are trying to mitigate risk. And he said, wow, they're just thinking about all these really complex problems that are out of their control, many of them, the weather, international grain markets, operating loans. And he said there is so much more that goes into making a conservation project decision than just a resource concern. And he concluded that a lot of us as conservation partners are really out of touch with the reality of how farmers are making these decisions, and that we need to learn more. And alongside with these interviews, we heard a lot of frustration with the current programs, the current conservation programs, that they're rigid and flexible, there's too much red tape, that the processing time is too long, that there's onerous management requirements. And so they were really asking for more flexible programming, some more flexible funding sources to do this kind of work. And then when we talked to the conservation partners across the watershed, they too were frustrated that not enough people were adopting the programs. And there were a really great, capable group of professionals down there with very busy work programs, but they felt mired in paperwork. And they want to do more outreach with the community. Then when we talked to the scientists that were studying this watershed as part of the watershed restoration and protection strategy, so they're looking at water chemistry, they're looking at geomorphology and hydrology, they're studying the biology, and they were really sounding an alarm of how this system is really degraded and out of control, and there's just so much need for change. And when we talked to the recreationalists, particularly those in the downstream portion of the watershed, they said, oh, we have been seeing amazing changes in this system, particularly in the last 7 to 10 years. The rivers are much flashier. We're seeing more erosion. There's a lot of channel erosion and trees down, and people are talking woefully about their fishing holes that are filling in. So there were a lot of resonance with what the scientists were talking about. And then when we went to talk to the cities, they wanted to talk about community, and many of the smaller communities in this region are seeing depopulation and real despair over the future of their communities. So they really wanted to talk about infrastructure and trying to manage really huge infrastructure problems and trying to figure out how to fund these infrastructure improvements. So we were very struck with the difference with how everybody was defining these problems across the watershed. And so we were exposed to this framework called Civic Governance by Peg Michaels and Lynn Colsey. And the approach really resonated with us because they said, what you need to do is those that are impacted by the problem should be the people that define the problem. And then secondarily, everyone should be able to seek solutions in terms of this public good, this common good. And thirdly, the challenge is for all of us to think about, we're all citizens, we can all take a role, we can all have a role and take action within our communities where we have those spheres of influences. So inspired by this kind of approach, we thought, okay, let's get a bunch of these amazing people that we had met through these process across the watershed, and let's invite them to have some community conversations about watershed health. So what we did is we pitched this idea to them. We said, you can have the opportunity to learn about what scientists were learning, during these scientific investigations all across the watershed. We'll also try to synthesize and explain what we heard from citizens all across the watershed. And then we can just have some groupthink together about and strategize solutions about how we might be able to improve the watershed health. So the group was comprised of watershed professionals. So we had federal, state, local, county, SWCD staff. We had a host of different folks from across the watershed: farmers, rural residents, city people, business owners, crop advisors. So it was a nice mix of group. They asked me to talk a little bit about the meeting style, the meeting approach. And we had very small group conversations. So this gives you a little bit of a flavor of what the meetings look like. So really small tables, 4 to 6 people. We'd always have a meal first, and people would kind of hang out and get to know each other as people. And we had really delicious food, that helped, and a good caterer there in St. James. And we also had delicious cake, so do not underestimate the power of delicious dessert to keep wooing people back to your meetings. And so we really were on patrol for any kind of this expert model. So we felt we wanted everyone to feel it was a level playing field. We knew how much people knew about this watershed. The local folks could contribute equally to the scientists. So we were very much on patrol and didn't want it to feel like it was a top-down expert model kind of approach, that everybody could contribute equally. So we're like, no tech talk, explain these complex things in a way everybody can understand. And then we got super lucky that we had scientists in this watershed that happened to be fantastic communicators with very deep roots in the community. So this is Pat Basfield, and he's an MPCA hydrologist. He lives on the Watonwan River. He loves the Watonwan River, and he has this kind of infectious, contagious love of the river. And I think that resonates with all of the watershed neighbors. We also had another scientific expert who grew up in the watershed, and he knows as much about the social networks as he does about these complex geomorphic conditions of the river. So we really got lucky with the quality of the scientists that we had that were such excellent communicators. So we hosted a series of 8 meetings, and we brainstormed together, and we developed these strategies, these leverage points that we were really interested in trying to learn more about. And they came up with some great ideas. So first of all, they said, the most important thing we need to do is build relationships and trust in this watershed. And a method, a route that we could do this is to have somebody that's a conservation consultant. So this idea was from a crop advisor, and he said, let's just do like a crop advisor where we have a SWCD staff position that's sole purpose is to do one-on-one interviews with producers all across the watershed. So get to know them, see what the issues they're trying to solve, help them understand how the SWCD can help. And so they would have equal kind of relationships as they do with their crop advisor is the goal. And another idea that they were promoting was, how about this traveling conservation circus? So this would be a trailer where you have watershed information, soil testing equipment like slate tests and a rainfall simulator, and you go from small town to small town and host meetings and invite people and help them understand their watershed. There was a lot of discussion about the importance of this, like the sub-watershed scale is resonating with people in their neighborhood. So they're saying, let's go out in these small towns and just have discussions with people. So this is Steve Soderman, who's a champion for the idea of a conservation consultant idea. So improved targeting, they talked a lot about how can we do a better job targeting our conservation efforts in this watershed. And so they said, let's hone in on the subwatershed scale. Let's use some of these new GIS techniques that are so powerful at painting a picture of where these opportunity areas are within subsheds. And in particular, they pointed to the agricultural conservation planning framework as a good tool to use. They also said, let's really focus our efforts on marginal lands. There's huge opportunity there. And particularly if we can help work one-on-one with landowners to understand the long-term implications of farming these marginal areas. And there's some great tools out there like the Profit Zone Manager that really helps people understand doing what they were normally doing, or maybe putting in some conservation programs and focusing on the economic component of it. Another thing they said is, let's start looking at ditch improvements and really improve the communication between folks who are doing the ditch improvement projects and the SWCDs. And so they said, let's map and identify upcoming ditch improvements and try to get water storage on those systems. And that was championed by a local rural resident who was losing a lot of land in the downstream portion of the watershed. And so he started talking to DNR and PCA folks at these meetings. They said, we have to figure out a new way to get more storage on those systems. And finally, they really had a lot of conversations about soil health. And they said, what we need to do is form a soil health team, much like there's some great examples in Freeborn and Faribault counties. So this would be an opportunity for producers to get together, a very small group, and learn from one another and experiment with some of these soil health practices. And then also further to clarify the economics of doing some of these soil health practices. And so they suggested doing a banker education program and really fleshing out the economics of what does that conversion start looking like if people do adopt more soil health practices. What are the economics of that? So they said, let's go to bankers, have a group of soil health farmers talk to bankers and tell them about how they're saving money with these approaches. So the people that were champions for this is local folks that are experimenting with cover crops. This is J.D. Tippin. And no-till. This is Tom Muller. So for lesson learned, people at the local level have great ideas, and there is so much wisdom that we need to take the time to learn from them. And they will ground us in what is possible, what are workable solutions locally. And the collective knowledge is a really powerful thing to tap into. So we were affirmed by this when I was reading this article by a Harvard law professor that's really looking at the legal and policy analysis, trying to figure out a new framework for watershed work across the nation. And I got chills when I was reading the article, because it was really a lot of the things that this smart people in rural Minnesota framed up. So I think there's so much wisdom in this approach. It takes a lot of time to organize people, but I think it's a really promising approach to consider. Now I'll pass it over to Paul.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a couple disclosures. First of all, I'm still learning, just like Michelangelo. And part of that's because the world is now changing very rapidly around us. We need to recognize that. And also because people like Amit and May are producing new information all the time about this part of the social side that makes me very excited for where this could go into the future. And secondly, a lot of what I'm about to tell you was actually made possible by others. And I'll use the term we frequently, but I mean that in a collective sense of all the partners that I've had. When I think about this, I start with this number right here. This is the amount of land in Minnesota that is privately managed. That comes from NPR very recently. When I look at Scott County, where I'm from, I know this is higher because we don't have a lot of the national forests and so forth. So bottom line is most of the land is privately owned. We need to work with these people, and we know that what happens on the land affects water resources. The second thing that occurs to me when I think about it from my perspective is that, wow, I've got 130,000 people in Scott County, 55,000 households, thousands of businesses, hundreds of farmers, and I have a staff of 3 to 4, including myself. So I need partners. We started down this process of relationship building about 10 years ago in 2008. And it appears to us to be working. And when we look at 2008, number of technical assistance requests by landowners voluntarily calling into the Scott Soil and Water Conservation District was 60 to 70 at any one time. That's what they were holding on their records. By 2015, it was in the 250s. And I just looked, last August, it was 275. So this is This is increasing. We feel good that the relationship building approach that we've bought into is generating that interest by landowners, by this private land holding side. And you know, along with that comes we're putting more stuff on the ground. Collectively with the various SWCDs, we also work with Rice and Musser SWCD. Thank you guys. We have put in hundreds and hundreds of practices with landowners over the last 10 years. And we've ourselves at the Scott County, where we take on the larger capital projects, we put on the ground, you know, dozen or more larger capital style projects. But more importantly, we're seeing water resource improvements. And a lot of this comes together in a story that I'd like to share with you. This whole thing of relationship building, tapping into networks, building capacity of the locals comes together in a story about McMahon Lake, or as the locals call it actually, Carl's Lake, which is a small lake in Scott County. And it's been adopted by the local sportsman's club. The Newmarket Sportsman's Club has done a number of things on the lake over the years. We were working on a TMDL back in 2008 or 9, and I keep the Newmarket Sportsman's Club informed. It's kind of fun to go to their meetings and talk to them. And at one of the meetings, one of the club members asked me, "Are you talking with the landowners around the lake?" And I responded, "We're trying to, but I'm having a tough time having them attend meetings." And he offered to set up a meeting. And I said, "Yeah, great, let's go ahead. It's great to have someone else do it. It's usually more meaningful for someone else in the community to do it." So he set up a meeting, and given that McMahon Lake is pretty small, we could fit myself and all the landowners around a card table in the back of the bar there. And before the meeting started, we were having kind of the typical chit-chat that happens before a meeting. And one of the landowners was complaining about erosion on their shoreline. And I was about to jump in and explain our cost share program and how we could do things for them and so forth. But one of the other landowners we were already working with. And before I could say something, he jumped in and he said, see if I can remember it precisely, because this is so cool. You dream of witnessing the referral, and it doesn't happen in front of your face very often. But he said, "I'm having erosion problems on my shoreline, and I'm working with these guys. They're great. You should do it." I was like, wow. Okay, so I basically shut up. I gave the contact information. The person within a week had contacted the local soil water conservation district, and ultimately they put a shoreline project on their land. But it doesn't stop there. The person that originally set up this meeting, the member of the Sportsman's Club, within the next year had put another practice in on his land adjacent to another lake. And then within a few months, he also talked the Sportsman's Club into approaching us about putting a no-wake ordinance on the lake in order to protect the shoreline. And we did. Again, the Sportsman's Club took the lead, set up the meetings. Jointly, we wrote an ordinance that had local support. And just in time, too, because the next year it rained like crazy, we had a presidential disaster declaration in very high lake levels. But again, the story doesn't end there. Turns out one family owned most of the shoreline. And what does family do? They talk to each other. So again, this networking is going on. We ended up putting quite a few practices, or a number of practices in the watershed to the lake. The lake has improved quite a bit. And we got it delisted, taken off the impaired waters list here about 2 years ago. I sent out a thank you to the community, announcing the delisting, thanking them for doing their stewardship. The result was we got 2 more calls for assistance. Success breeds success. And last time I was at the Sportsman's Club, they had our graph posted on the wall of the Sportsman's Club showing how water clarity in McMahon Lake has improved from being less than a meter in 2005 to being over 2 meters more recently. That's great news. But the more important thing was, by them posting it, they took ownership. So finally, I just want to, you're wondering about dopamine. How many people know or heard of dopamine? Quite a few of you. So, so far, Amit and Kim are experiencing a little bit of dopamine because it's one of the chemicals that is produced in your brain that regulates some behaviors and feelings. And it's produced when you get acknowledgement or are thanked. And it feels good. And guess what? People want to repeat the behavior that led to that good feeling. So that's the story about dopamine. And this is a picture of a celebration that we had in August where we invited all the folks who had done conservation practices with us over the past few years. We did it again. We did it previously 5 years previous to this. This time we had about 200 people attend. That's not all who have worked with us. But what I want to say is this idea of thank you, reinforcing success is part of the whole thing of getting them to believe that their behavior, taking action, will make a difference. It normalizes the behavior of conservation. It acknowledges that that's a normal behavior by getting together around it and having the conversation without trying to sell them on more. Just celebrate what's been done. And finally, I'm going to just branding. I also try to brand a little bit. Not myself, not the organization that I work for, but I say when I speak to them, I believe that they are good stewards, and I try to have them believe that about themselves because I find that then that's part of their normal behavior. And finally, Amit started out with this idea of wonder, and I just want to close on that as well because I wonder now, I've seen success at Scott County using some of these types of things in relationship building. And we flopped around a little bit, tried different things, experimented. But now that Amit and May have mapped a lot of this out, I wonder where it can go. And I think it can go a long way to helping us with our issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that, hearing those perspectives. Reminder to go to Pigeonhole to see the questions that have been asked, if you can still work on voting and looking or adding questions if you're interested in that. We do have some time for that. So the panel's going to be here, and you guys can jump in however you'd like to do that for answering the questions. First one we have is, in this increasingly polarized world, social networking has created insulated echo chambers. How can water organizations reach outside our own loops to build relationships and trust with other groups?
I'll take a start. Is this on? Okay. And you guys can think of the real answer while I'm doing this, but I was talking to Gene Soderbeck when we came in, and there's a fine line between encouraging people, providing them information, supporting them, giving success stories, thanking them, and social engineering. And so the reaching out to other groups and so forth has to kind of come from the heart. If you're perceived as being manipulative, you're kind of in trouble. And so part of it is then knowing and getting to know who the leaders are and the various networks, and just providing them appropriate information and treating them like you trust them. And then word spreads, is my experience.
I think for us too, a lot of what we've found is that a lot of this idea of relationship building and networking still happens on a personal basis. It's not so much the use of social networks as in terms of the electronic social networks that leads to those relationships and personal connections. A lot of times when we ask about information sources, there's still really a lot about how do we connect with individuals on a personal basis, and not so much kind of the use of social networks. Now, they could be a tool that could perhaps be used, and I think there needs to be more research in that area. But a lot of connections, particularly when you look at landowners and farmers, a lot of those connections are really made through one-on-one connections and those referrals.
BMPs are cumulative and can take decades to improve a resource. How do you convince people to implement more when many are focused on instant gratification and don't see the long-term picture?
From my experience, I think the more you can help people understand what the research is showing about the benefits of those BMPs, I think people want to know if it's worth the hassle, is kind of what we heard in our interviews. So to the degree that we can explain what we know clearly to them, say it's worth it for the hassle in the long run to see those improvements.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that question, because that was one of the points that I also wanted to highlight was this idea of an ecological feedback, that's something that really does take a while. So it takes a while after you put up conservation practice to start seeing improvements. So that ecological feedback that you might get would take a while. But I think the other focus, and the focus that we should have in a lot of ways, is on providing that social feedback. So this idea of, this when people want that more immediate kind of information, more immediate feedback, providing that social feedback about what others are doing is something that can happen more rapidly than ecological feedback, and it may also be longer lasting. So for a lot of farmers, they're very likely to use practices if they know that others around them are also using practices, if they can talk to others who use practices, because then they can connect with others. There's a lot of information sharing happening in that way as well. So again, I think focusing on that, providing social feedback and not just explicitly and exclusively on looking at ecological feedback for practices would be a good idea.
All right, thank you. Next, we have, as we look around the room and see a majority of white faces, how do we increase cultural competence and engagement in communities of color?
Well, I think what we're looking at is, kind of emerging challenges in water resources that, how do we build in ideas of equity and diversity in water management? We've done some research in urban areas, so with the metro area watersheds and with Minnehaha Creek watershed, looking at ideas of, how do communities of color, how are they engaged in water planning, what may be some constraints to their action and engagement in conservation and water resource planning. And what we found is that I think, and a lot of this relates to everything societally as well. So I think there's this connection between everything that happens societally versus water. And I would like to actually urge everyone to not kind of think just within the water world and start connecting with other issues and ideas. And one of the things we find is that a lack of intercultural connections, again, those relationships across cultures have come up quite a bit. We've also had participants talk about issues of equity and racism and so forth that have come up. And I think in terms of, as it relates directly to water planning, a lot of issues of procedural justice. So not having a voice in community planning, not having a voice in water planning, never being asked to be engaged in water planning. A lot of those issues have come up, and I think so. I think it's more. It's not so much about increasing cultural competence within communities of color. It's more about how do we integrate and assure communities of color, and how do we ensure that our projects and programs have the ideas of equity and fairness built into them.
Great, thank you. How does the conservation consultant idea differ from what SWCD staff are already doing?
I think the main focus is that that's their entire job, is doing that one-on-one farm networking. And so right now I think that the local staff had a variety of responsibilities, and this conservation consultant would only be reaching out to farmers one-on-one.
All right. What is a good social scientist response to someone who says my actions alone will not have a significant impact on stream, river, or lake water quality? And how do we combat the tragedy of the commons?
I think that's an issue of, as a social scientist, I like to say that's an issue of self-efficacy. So this idea that I won't really have an impact on my actions alone will not have an impact on what happens with water resources. And so don't let this get out of this room. So, but in a lot of ways, you know, that idea does make sense. It's because water resource problems are collective problems that have collective consequences. So it does require collective action. And I think the way to get out of this idea of the tragedy of the commons is in this collective action, and how do we collectively manage these water resources, and not necessarily think about top-down approaches as the only way forward, or market approaches as the only way forward. There's a lot, I think, in how we can work together with one another, and this idea of relationship building works quite a bit, because just because things are a public good or a common do not necessarily have to lead to ruin, right? We can work collectively on a lot of issues, and I think we've seen some of that happening already.
Let me add to that just a little bit. One of the things that holds people up is whether or not they believe that their action will add to this in terms of also the long time frame, and we've kind of covered that in a couple questions. And what we've tried to do is to intentionally train staff to tell stories, tell success stories, so that people develop this belief. So they don't believe that their individual action will help. We have stories about collective action actually resulting in improvement in McMahon Lake, or in our case also Credit River, and to have staff have the ability to tell these stories as they're working on these one-on-one relationships with people. And then we also tell success stories about individuals. We publish in the paper when we have leaders do stuff. We acknowledge them and so forth. So success stories at different scales, both about people or about the resource.
How do you facilitate community conversations to ensure that the loudest voices were not the only ones represented in the recommendations you developed?
There's something magical that happens at really small groups. So small tables, 4 to 6 people maximum. Sometimes there is this equalizing factor. People relate more one-on-one. So I think that small group process is a really big piece of it. And I think how you manage the larger group, and if those are those dominating folks, I think you have to find facilitators that are good at managing group process.
Great. Next question. You asked the questions about the value and protection, restoration of water. Even polluters may say they care. Have you asked if people know their own impact and if they're willing to pay, and how much?
Yeah, so in a lot of surveys we have asked kind of this connection between different actions, and if they see that connection between what we do on the landscape versus what happens with the water resources, this idea of, are they aware of the consequences of water pollution? So that does come up quite a bit. And again, I think going back to this idea of, I think even polluters may care, and that is definitely true. And I think there needs to be a little bit more research done on kind of piecing out where pollution is coming from and what are different sources of pollutants. And that's actually another thing we do ask about in our surveys is what do people think are different sources of pollutants? What do people think are important or critical pollutants that they're concerned about? So those issues do come up in our surveys. The kind of this idea of willingness to pay, we're getting into a little bit more of that as we work closely with Jeff and others at the Water Resource Center, where we're trying to get a grasp of what are these social values that people hold for water, but also in terms of their willingness to pay, these economic value that people attach to water. We're trying to kind of integrate those social and economic aspects of water management through more research in the future.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How have you changed your communication approaches to reflect lessons learned in this process? For instance, messaging and style of communication.
I suppose that's me. We're a little bit on the ground, and it's tough for me to answer that one because I have so many partners, and it's mostly training and the good work of those partners. But I did mention before we'd had staff training for storytelling. I've sent out communications to the collective, my staff and the staff of the Scott SWCD on the value of acknowledging people, building their dopamine, and reinforcing that with staff. We've also changed a little bit, and this started actually a number of years ago, where in talking to staff, or collectively between us at the county and the Soil Water District, we divided responsibilities that my staff at the county was going to take relationship building with organizations like the Sportsman's Club, like the lake associations, like with cities, like with other kind of more group types of things. The Soil Water District took relationships with individual farmers, individual landowners. Scott County, we're a county in transition, so we looked at it and we had probably about 40 producers that now worked most of the land. That was a manageable number to assign staff to go out and build relationships with. And one of the first things that we did is a kind of a variation of this consultant idea, is they went out and had coffee with each of the people that they were assigned to develop relationships with. And we learned a lot about their business, so we could react better to their business, react better to their needs. And then we also just repeated that this last winter. So 5 years in between, we went back, had coffee with them again. But that's built relationships, and it was sort of intentional between staff and the folks who do manage the largest chunks of land.
Okay. Next question. It seems cultivating local leaders and scientists is highly valued because they have unique insight in their own communities. How can we improve this in underrepresented communities?
Well, I think for me, one of the first things is I think there still needs to be a lot of research in understanding underrepresented communities. Some of the research that we've done, particularly related to water resource planning and management, is that what we find is typically underrepresented communities are underrepresented because they're not well represented in water resource planning. And I think one of the ways, I think the very first way to kind of connect and identify people in communities of color is just kind of listening and getting to know them and asking. Right? I think a lot of communities have never even been asked to be involved. And so I think that's the very first step, is that we ask communities to be involved, we get to know them. A lot of the same kind of relationship building ideas apply. But I think even beyond that, it is also about the cultural understanding. I think one thing to do is think of ourselves not just as kind of water people, but think beyond that. And try to relate to communities and what their concerns are. A lot of times, communities of color, immigrant communities could have completely different concerns, even down to what nature and environment and water means to them is very different from what it may mean for the dominant culture. So again, trying to understand that and how they relate to water. So, trails and swimming on the lake may not be a huge thing for immigrant communities, for example. But then we need to find other ways of connecting to communities of color.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. These strategies all are ways to get farmers to change practices. How many or what percentage of participants at the meetings that you held were farmers?
Sounds like it's targeted to this project. So it was about a third of the group, I think, were farmers, but we were informed by a whole lot of interviewing from all across the watershed. So the input was from more broad.
All right, let's give our panel another round of applause. Thank you.